Evening and welcome to our program. My name is Gavin Cleespies and I am the Director of Programs, Exhibitions, and Community Partnerships for the Massachusetts Historical Society. I'd like to offer a special welcome to anyone who may be attending a virtual MHS program for the first time. We are an independent nonprofit organization that maintains a library for researchers of all types. Because of the support of our donors, we can keep our library open to the public. We hope you will return for future events, and if you enjoy our programs, we hope you'll consider supporting our work by becoming a member, which will also allow you to attend members-only events. And when we are back to having live in-person programs, we'll allow you to join our programs for free. This evening, we'll discuss the book 9 Days, The Race to Save Martin Luther King Jr.'s Life and Win the 1960 Election. We are actually joined by both of the co-authors, Stephen Kendrick and Paul Kendrick, although we believe that Paul Kendrick will be possibly distracted. Stephen Kendrick will be in conversation with Larry Tye. Larry Tye is also an author and a longtime friend of the Massachusetts Historical Society. In fact, exactly a year ago, we hosted him to speak about his book Demagogue, The Life and Long Shadow of Senator Joe McCarthy. And just about 4 years ago, we hosted him to talk about his book, Bobby Kennedy, The Making of a Liberal Icon. He is also the author of 6 other books, and we will welcome him to introduce Stephen Kendrick and take the show on the road. So Larry, if you want to turn on your camera, great to see you again.
So great to be with you again. And I want to put in a quick pitch that anybody who's not a member of the Mass Historical Society should sign up, because it is one of the truly great historical institutions in America. Speaking of great, we have our 2 speakers here tonight, and that is a surprise and a delight. Stephen Kendrick, the father, is also Stephen Kendrick, senior minister at the Great First Church in Boston. And that's a title that he holds for exactly 2 more weeks when he becomes minister emeritus and gets to relax and spend time with his children and his growing flock of grandchildren. Stephen has been minister of the Universalist Church of West Hartford. He was a minister in Maryland, but what he's here tonight to talk about is one of his great books. And I knew that Stephen had written great books on race history in America. He and Paul co-wrote a book called Douglas and Lincoln, How a Revolutionary Black Leader and a Reluctant Liberator Struggled to End Slavery and Save the Union. They also co-wrote a book called Sarah's Long Walk, The Free Blacks of Boston and How Their Struggle for Equality Changed America. But he's also author of a series of books on faith issues, and one on one of my favorite places in America, which is the Mount Auburn Cemetery. It's a book called, appropriately, The Lively Place, Mount Auburn, America's First Garden Cemetery and its Revolutionary and Literary Residents. His son, Paul, is a veteran of the Obama White House, where he helped recruit all the good people, only the good people who worked in the Obama administration, which was a lot of people. He is now helping to save America as executive director of a group called Rust Belt Rising, which trains leaders in the Midwest to connect with working families. It teaches them how to thankfully win elections and how to deliver change and create thriving communities. The more important role that he has tonight, though, is an expectant father. His wife could interrupt proceedings here tonight at any moment with the news that she is in labor, and we wish him luck, and we hope that she holds off for exactly 55 more minutes. So I want to just say a word before we get to our opening of the discussion tonight, and it's a word about people who write books on topics that have had a lot written on them, and lots of people do that, but few do it as skillfully as this pair. When there have been literally, as I know, looking across my study here at the hundreds of books there written on Jack Kennedy and on Martin Luther King and on Bobby Kennedy and on their times and on their movements. But I think it was a brilliant idea to dig into their history by going deep on a very focused story. and especially one that offers a lens into so much more that matters. They're not the first to do this. A long time ago, a guy named Arthur Schlesinger picked 1,000 days to look at in the too short Kennedy administration, and his book was actually called The 1,000 Days. Robert Kennedy wrote a famous book that dug deep into the Cuban Missile Crisis, and it was called 13 Days. Now, these two have gotten it down. They don't have to bother us with 1,000 days. They're not even going to take us to 13 days. Now we have their estimable 9 days that helps us see in new and illuminating ways both the 1960 election and the life and near death of Martin Luther King Jr. And I'd love to ask Stephen as we open here now, could you take about 5 minutes, Stephen, to set the opening scene with Martin Luther King's arrest and conviction?
A lot of people have maybe heard or seen a footnote in the voluminous biography that you've talked about of the arrest of Martin Luther King, literally less than 3 weeks before the 1960 election. What people haven't drilled down to and understood is what a pivotal moment that was. It was not just the saving of one young man's life, although that's key to the future unfolding of the civil rights movement. If Martin Luther King had gone to jail, been condemned to 4 months on a chain gang, and possibly, as his father, Daddy King, was informed, that very likely his son would be killed in Reidsville Penitentiary in Georgia, there would have been a different kind of history for us. There would have been no March on Washington. There would have been no Birmingham campaign, no March on Selma, and no Memphis. So American history changed by the fact that a rogue group of 3 very interesting and distinguished men, Sergeant Shriver, Harris Wofford, and the uncovering, one of the great things we've done in this book, I feel like, is our contribution to American history by uncovering a true American hero, the Chicago newspaper man, Louis Martin, a Black newspaper man who joined this white team that was really responsible for civil rights in the Kennedy campaign. And they kind of went rogue to save Martin Luther King's life. Any move that either the Nixon campaign or the Kennedy campaign made in the days before the election, anything, any slight movement or mistake in an election this close could have changed everything. But Paul, my son, hello, Paul, welcome, was able to discover a long lost trial transcript that allowed us to really create not only the arrest of Martin Luther King in Rich's department store in Atlanta, but also the trial, and give us the sense literally of conversation. And we were able to sort of take a story that had been just really a footnote and be able to find how it functioned, how it worked, and how it shifted the election. What we've discovered, and other historians and political scientists have backed this up for a long time, is that in those 2.5 weeks, the Black vote shifted about 7% away from Nixon and the Republicans into Kennedy. This is a world we don't know much about. On the surface we do, but this is a world in which Nixon is seen as a racial moderate, where Kennedy is seen as a bit of a Massachusetts dilettante who, plays footsie with Southern Democratic senators. And frankly, Kennedy doesn't have much authority with Black voters. And it's only in the course of this election that something significant changes. And when he calls Coretta King and offers his support, when Bobby later calls the judge, and we rewrite a lot of history. virtually every story that's been written on this topic is working from incorrect information. So we've been able to sort of find the true story. And it's an important story because basically Richard Nixon had the future of Black republicanism in his hands. He had the possibility of getting up to nearly 50% of the Black vote. But instead, everything shifted. And it is in this election that Black voters began the migration into the Democratic Party as a solid base. And it is in this moment that the Republican Southern strategy is born. And we see the fruits of that, the ill fruits of that, to this day. So it's an amazing story. Yes, it's only 9 days, but it's a story of micro-history where a lot of vast movements are distilled into one moment. And it's an inherently dramatic and narrative-driven story. And it was just great fun to write. It was great to research. And we've really tried to make it as vivid and compelling a narrative as we can make it, to really give you a sense of, you may not know this story, but when you're done, you're going to understand the dynamics, not just of this 1960 election, but a lot of the relationship between white and Black in the labyrinth of our history. And I hope I did in 5 minutes. There we go.
So that was very nicely done according to the clock. Paul, can I follow up with you on the, we're here in front of the Historical Society and people are interested in the process as well as the results of a book like yours. What was this transcript? What did it show that we didn't know before? And how did you find it?
Well, first off, we have to say, we're indebted to great historians like you, Larry, and you shared an interview with John Siegenthaler before his death, which was so vital.
We really needed that, yeah.
And we wish we could have talked to him. And anyway, your book, Bobby Kennedy, was such a guide for us, and one of our favorite books, and something that just continuing building off great other historians like yourself. So thank you, and thank you for doing this conversation with us today. So in one of the other heroes we really fell in love with was King's lawyer, who was a brave figure named Donald Hollowell, who had traveled the back roads of Georgia defending Black men falsely accused of things, risking his life. And he took on King's case. And in his recently opened papers in Atlanta, there was a copy of the trial transcript with his, typed, but with his notes on it for kind of his plans for the appeal. And because it had all these people's testimony, including King's, it really gave us the dialogue for King's arrest in Rich's department store when he was arrested with more than 50 Atlanta student movement protesters, and then the trial itself, when King is sentenced to 4 months in Reedsville, where at that point Coretta, it was the time she was most scared for his life, and would lead her to urgently call their friend Harris Wofford, who was working on the Kennedy campaign, and really conveyed how the stakes had escalated, and Harris would have to do more that would lead him and Louis Martin to really go rogue for King. So that was part of how we really fell in love also with the Atlanta side of the story. So this began because we got to know Harris Wofford, kind of one of the last surviving advisors on the Kennedy campaign, and listen to him and recording his stories, and then getting really interested in his sadly deceased but partner on the campaign, Louis Martin, getting to know Louis' daughters, getting to find in the Library of Congress Louis' unpublished recollections for a memoir that he never completed, that again helped give this vividness of this camaraderie of this interracial team that had such fun in really changing American history, orchestrating something pretty incredible, but that led us to the Atlanta side of the story, where getting to know Lonnie King, who was the leader of the Morehouse and Spelman and these Black college students that were doing these sit-ins. And so through Lonnie and then his friends who are still with us that we got to know, and as well as someone like Andrew Young, they helped us understand the Martin Luther King of this moment, who had just moved home to Atlanta, who was struggling to figure out how he was going to make national change after this one-hit wonder from Montgomery bus boycott, and how his father didn't want him to go to jail, and what it was like being in a jail cell with King. And then when King is separated from them after their release and he's off to Reidsville, that sense of guilt and responsibility that they might just have gotten their friend killed, and what that was like. But how this moment for King of facing down death for the first time, solitary confinement, his anxiety, was really going to allow him to then, as he told Andrew Young, go on to Birmingham and do the things he needed to do to achieve that mission that he was trying to figure out how to do, of making national change and moving the hearts and minds in America to pass civil rights legislation, and into our legal caste system. And so in those Atlanta days of spending time in Lonnie King's house before his passing and recording his stories, and understanding how these bold students who decided they were going to interject themselves into this election, and they were going to force politicians who were reluctant to talk about these explosive issues, they were going to force them to talk about the sit-ins because their emergingly famous friend Martin Luther King was going to go to jail with them. And in those times in Atlanta, it was amazing at the Sweet Auburn Avenue Research Center to find that transcript. But we also found wonderful things in the Kennedy Library, as well as the Nixon Library, of what was happening on that side of it. And so it was wonderful bringing all these things together. And that excitement when you find something that you can't wait to see on the page. But as with you, we try to write in that narrative fashion, and we need, you need those details for the vividness that makes a reader feel like they're there.
And when you're able to sort of not rewrite history, but sort of break through myth and really establish some things that other historians had just taken on faith. And sometimes we're proud of the way that we were able to retell the story and give it a much firmer historical base. So yes, the story is inherently dramatic. People have said to us, oh my gosh, it's very cinematic. And we're happy that it is. But that's only because that's where the facts took us. I just want to say one quick thing about the young students in Atlanta. We're kind of seeing that live again in this era of Black Lives Matter. King was a young man. He was only 31 years old when he went to prison in 1960. It's very difficult for us to accept just how young the protagonists in this book are, including Nixon and Kennedy. But they, in a sense, as I said, it's an origin story. It's about King before he is the mythic character that we conceive of him now. And we can get a little bit closer to him and understand the choices that he had to make. And it is in this moment where, and Paul's right, his family thought this was probably the most dangerous part of his life, that the sense of just how close to death he was, and what it took to free him and get him out of prison.
So we will get into what the Kennedys and their aides did, and their orchestrations in freeing him and letting him live on to do all the great things he did. But before we do that, I want to ask a bit about Nixon and Eisenhower. What fascinates me about this story is that while the Kennedys had Democratic politicians in Georgia that they could work behind the scenes to pull certain things off, the ones who had the real levers of power were the Eisenhower White House, and presumably a president who wanted to see his vice president continue Republican domination. Did they blow it? Could Nixon and Eisenhower have done things here that the Kennedys ended up doing to free King and get credit for it?
Absolutely. The students actually made a bet among themselves. They assumed that it would be Nixon who would speak out for their friend, Martin Luther King Jr. It didn't turn out that way. Nixon stayed silent. Eisenhower stayed silent. Eisenhower's Department of Justice stayed silent. One of the things we tried to establish is that Nixon was getting the same advice that Kennedy was getting. in a sense, both sides were getting staffers who were impatient to, in a sense, go rogue. On the Kennedy side, we talk about Jackie Robinson, who tried desperately to get Nixon to speak out, and other staffers who were close. And Paul was able to discover in the Nixon library dozens of telegrams from Black Republicans all over the country asking that the candidate speak out. Nixon would not do that. I think he was entranced by an appearance he'd made in Atlanta early in the campaign, where, you know, downtown Atlanta was full of people, and he had this vision that somehow the Republican Party could flip the South, and that would change American politics forever. And that's probably the reason he never spoke out. There was a sense of personal pain and betrayal. Nixon and King had met in Ghana 3 years before these events, and King had visited Nixon in Washington, and they thought that they had a friendship. Daddy King endorsed Richard Nixon the day before his son's arrest. And the King family had traditionally, as many Atlanta Black families had done, traditionally voted Republican. And so this was an amazing shift. You can sort of see it happening in real time. And it changed our politics forever.
So I think of Richard Nixon. There are a lot of things that history assigns to him in terms of roles. One of them, to me, is one of the most astute politicians in American history. But it also seems to me that one of the only politicians in 20th century American history who was more astute, more willing to do whatever it took to win, was a guy that history doesn't judge as a great politician, and that was Bobby Kennedy. Did Bobby Kennedy show in what he was doing behind the scenes here that he got, in a way that even his brother Jack might not have, just how to make this work for them? What was his role?
Well, I'll let Paul take that one too.
Great. Okay.
Yeah, why don't you take that one, Paul?
Yeah, we kind of came to feel, and this was something that Harris Wofford said to us before his death, that when they get Kennedy to make this call to Coretta that Harris and Louis had talked about, that Shriver brings to Kennedy without the other advisors around, and Kennedy initiates these back channels that then Bobby is working on with these, Southern white supremacist Democratic leaders who do not like Martin Luther King, but they're trying to solve a problem for their party now, that Harris Wofford and the Kennedy has, in an unsanctioned way, gotten them involved in. That, as Harris put it, they kind of, once they had done this gesture, they were inclined to actually solve the problem. They were inclined to get this guy out of prison. And their Louis Martin, who became very close to Bobby Kennedy, and really, I think, helped Bobby understand, Louis' own Black experiences and perspectives and the urgency of civil rights. He felt that Bobby, was morally affronted by this ridiculous sentence, and it did upset him, and he would not have chosen to link himself to this controversial young minister necessarily, and get involved in this situation with his jailing and risk not holding on to the white Democratic South. But the more Bobby thought about it, it really was bad. But it wasn't, Bobby's call to the judge was not a spontaneous anger thing, but part of, and it, I think it kind of reads like a spy novel of these back channels of how, and how that happened. But Bobby had such a strong moral sense of things that, as much as he was, a hard-nosed political campaign manager for his brother, and that's why he liked Louis Martin, who also, understood from Chicago, how to have hard political advice. Bobby liked Louis Martin more than Wofford, the white liberal, who he didn't really trust, or even his brother-in-law, Sergeant Shriver. But But Bobby really did feel that this was wrong, and certainly John Kennedy, in making the call to credit, we don't think in making that call he thought it was going to change American politics. He thought it was, the right thing to do for a scared widow, scared a wife whose husband who was in danger of becoming a widow. So yeah, that's how we see it, and yeah, so certainly the Kennedys, I think, could hold two thoughts in their head, and doing a morally decent thing, but there was, potential political upside. But I think what we do want the readers to understand is there was a lot of political downside. Like, it might sound obvious, like doing this nice gesture, but at the time, people didn't take the black vote seriously. They weren't understanding that in these key swing states, just a movement of black voters would tip these states. And the 1960 election was close all over the country. It's not like our elections stay with a few key swing states. All these states were close. So when you do have black votes shifting to the Democratic Party, that affects, we think, at least 9 states in being the difference. But it really could have gone the other way, where they lose the white Democratic South that Nixon, in not speaking up for his friend, was really seduced in thinking that he might capture, and eventually would, but not this time.
So, Paul, a quick follow-up on that. So Bobby makes that phone call. The phone call to Coretta King is a wonderfully empathetic phone call. Was the phone call to the judge legal? The idea of an extra party person getting involved like that?
Well, I don't think the legal ethics are good on that. I'm calling the judge in charge of a sitting case. And Harris Wofford later joked about that to a Bobby advisor who didn't find that very funny. But it was it's fascinating. It's kind of a story of how the Democratic Party changes and the Republican Party changing of how that was put in motion. But by the time it happened and Bobby made that call, it was very transactional, and they knew what had to be done for their party to get this mess solved that their party, the people of their party, had caused, these Georgia Democratic politicians, this judge who persecuted Bobby. So, the persecuted King. I don't know if that would be that's supposed to be allowed, but it is what happened. And the judge just came out there and says it. I've received this interest from a presidential candidate's family, but Louis Martin was, and they will get into this, but was a real genius and Harris and Shriver immediately backed him in thinking, hey, we have to tell the story of what our candidate did for this person, because that's going to, get to voters' hearts and really show Kennedy's character. And so, obviously Nixon really underestimated the power of that gesture. The power, but because it does deal with political courage and as black voters were figuring out who could we trust to advance civil rights and care about us, Kennedy had then given a window into some hope that they'd be the ones to back on that.
Stephen, most of the characters in this story, we've got a smart audience here of people who are involved with the Historical Society, and they know major historical figures in their story. They know the Kennedys, they know Nixon and Eisenhower, and probably even Shriver and Wofford. But one of the figures that you mentioned early on and that Paul was just talking about is somebody new to all of us. Tell us about Louis Martin, his role here, and his role in helping change America.
Louis Martin is sometimes referred to as the presidential whisperer and the Black Godfather of American politics. He is a largely unknown figure because he preferred it that way. He was an advisor. He was a person who didn't need to take a lot of the claim and the praise. He thought that he would be more effective if he didn't get that attention. But he was intent upon, yes, helping to free Martin Luther King, but he was also intent upon making sure that the first Black jurist became part of the Supreme Court, which he achieved. It was basically his influence and machinations that got Thurgood Marshall on the Supreme Court. He was the first person to quietly get the first cabinet member of rank for a black politician. So it was his idea, and his dream was to have the world's best Rolodex of talented blacks who could be inserted into the government so they could begin to have a voice and a stake in governance. And so he felt that he didn't need to be the front guy. When Paul found his unpublished memoirs, he told some amazing stories. I mean, he was there with Shriver on the night of the Kennedy assassination and helped put together the funeral. He was there at crucial key moments, and yet historians have almost systematically ignored him. As a matter of fact, in a recent book just published, his name is misspelled. And so it goes on, even though we tried to create this feeling that this is an overlooked American hero. His ability, his sympathetic understanding of how government works, and how he talked about racism being a mountain that he had to shift. And he felt he really appreciated Martin Luther King. They weren't friends, they weren't close, but when King was given the Nobel Peace Prize, he bought his own ticket to go and watch it happen. And he was there in Memphis for the funeral. So King meant a lot to him, but they understood that they worked in very different ways. King was always a front man and is the kind of person who shifted people's hearts and minds. Louis Martin was a different kind of hero, in that he made things happen quietly, but he made sure that they did happen. And we feel that one of the great overlooked moments in his life is how he really helped create this groundswell. If you can move 7% of a large block of votes in the last 2 weeks of an election, you're a really good and shrewd politician. But that's precisely what he did, because he created the blue bomb, and potentially up to 3.5 million blue bombs with blue pamphlets went out into black barbershops and black churches. The white reporters and white politicians ignored this. They didn't even know that it was happening. They weren't paying the slightest bit of attention. But in black communities all across America, Louis Martin got the story out. And that's really what shifted the votes at the last minute. And so, and he was able to work, again, this is a world we don't understand, the civil rights agenda of a major American campaigns being headed by two white guys. Shriver and Wofford understood that they had to bring Louis Martin on, and they had the patience and self-understanding to realize they needed to listen, and they needed to be guided by Louis Martin. And to their credit, they did. And I want to go back just real quickly. One of the things that we talked about, yeah.
I just wanted to add just a quick Louis Martin note that folks, here in Boston should go see the Blue Bomb pamphlet that's in the Kennedy Presidential Library. It's displayed, and millions of those were distributed in black neighborhoods, communities, with white voters never finding out. And so that was real Louis' genius, and Shriver and Wofford, to their credit, their unequivocal backing of this idea, risking everything in this campaign and not telling the Kennedy brothers about it, and just doing it. So a really bold thing. And Louis was there in the White House cabinet room telling the Kennedy brothers, you need something as clear as dogs attacking these kids, and getting behind the civil rights legislation. He was there in Bobby's office saying, you can't take public accommodations out of the civil rights bill because there's an Italian restaurant up the street from me in Silver Spring that they'd say they won't let my daughter in, and I'm an old man, but I'd go in there and shoot them. So Bobby was like, oh my God. And so, Louis, and he's a really funny character. He's just wry and earthy, and his daughters helped us bring that to you as a reader. So I hope you get to know Louis. But sorry, Stephen, finish what you're saying.
No, I was just going to say, maybe one thing we didn't make clear at the very beginning was one of the reasons that Bobby got away with calling the judge which wasn't strictly speaking at all legal. One of the ways he got away with it is that what the judge had done was so outrageous. He'd basically taken Martin Luther King's, who had just recently moved back to his hometown of Atlanta, Georgia. He had an Alabama driver's license. For a $25 driving traffic misdemeanor, this judge was going to throw him into hard labor at Reidsville prison for 4 months, which would probably have killed him. And I think people all across the country, unless you were totally blinded by racism, understood the magnitude and the injustice of what was being done to King. And although King was not the major figure that he is today, enough people noticed that I think there was a large sense of sympathy that when the Kennedy campaign moved, that they were doing the right thing. It may have been inappropriate, but it was still the right thing.
So let me ask you, first of all, I want to just say to people who are listening, if you didn't see Sarah's chat note, submit your questions to her and she will get them ready. And we're going to devote the last 15 minutes of our program to not my questions, but your much better questions. So I just want to go back and one of the things that you said, Stephen, was that all of this changed in the last minute, all of these votes on election day. But there was one voter that they changed before election day, and that was somebody that the two of you mentioned at the beginning, who was Daddy King, who had come out and endorsed Richard Nixon. What did King father do in terms of reversing himself, and what was it? I love the poetic things that he said in urging voters to do something at the polls. What was that?
He basically got up the night of the freeing of his son and said that if he can dry the tears of my daughter-in-law, I have a suitcase full of votes and I'm going to dump him on his lap. It was an amazing thing when Daddy King shifted. I mean, he was shifting generations of self-understanding of Black Republican Southern voters, because Paul mentioned earlier how the Democratic politicians of the South had basically gotten everyone into this horrific situation. No one wanted to free King. King was an activist and was perceived as a troublemaker. He was just big trouble. I don't care how liberal you were, no presidential campaign in the last 2 weeks is going to want to involve themselves in this. Yet they had to, in the end, they had to, because it was so clearly unjust. And one of the things that Daddy King did was to begin that shift. One of the facts we uncovered is, again, there's so much mythology in this story that we had to break through. The reality was Blacks in Atlanta continued largely to vote Republican, but they cut the percentage so dramatically that in the end, Kennedy comfortably carried Georgia. But it was a sign of things to come. When LBJ signed the Civil Rights Act, he turned and gave a pin to Martin Luther King, and then he turned to another close political associate and said, "We've lost the South for a generation." And they did, and for more than a generation. And we're still seeing the ramifications of that. I don't want to, make this totally contemporary, but when you see the vaccination rates of Southern states, they're much lower than other parts of the country. This divide still infects our American politics, even on something as ridiculous as getting a vaccination shot. So what you referred to Nixon earlier in our conversation as a political genius, he was. FDR ran for national office 5 times, and Richard Nixon ran for national office 5 times. Richard Nixon is the shadow side of our political life. He was shrewd, and he was ultimately, in the end, completely amoral. He decided that all the goodwill that he'd built up during the Eisenhower years of being perceived as a racial moderate, as being the friend of the young Martin Luther King, of truly having the future of a new kind of Republican Party in his hands, he was willing to throw it away, and he never looked back. We were able to find one communication between Nixon and King in the succeeding 8 years. It's hard to believe that when King was murdered in Memphis, he was only 39 years old. So this is the story of relatively young men with a great deal of American history on their shoulders. When we interviewed Harris Wofford, he was the link between Kennedy and King, and that was often a very uneasy place to be. We may have mythologized the fact somehow that they were very close and that they had the same kind of moral agenda, but they were not close. They were very wary of each other, and they certainly they understood that their destinies were in odd ways interwoven, but they were not buddies, they were not friends. And so for Harris Wofford to be the intermediary, to be the person in communication, to get them to talk to one another, was in fact a very uneasy place for him to be. And there have been some great recent books, including your book and other books that talk about Bobby Kennedy and his evolution, I would say revolution in terms of moral sensibility. He was always perceived as the sort of angry young man who was brusque and sort of so pragmatic that he verged on the edge of you could hardly talk to him. He was going to create a venue for his brother that he showed such devotion to his brother's political fortunes. But after his brother's death, obviously, and you can talk about this, and we recommend you read Larry's wonderful biography of Bobby, there was this amazing moral shift. And again, you can't say that Martin Luther King Jr. and Bobby Kennedy were close, but they too began to realize that their destinies were interwoven. And much change happened in those 8 years. One of the things we did in the book is that when King is killed in Memphis, basically all the characters in the book come back and do meet again, including Bobby, literally weeks before his own assassination, and Harris Wofford and Louis Martin and Nixon. Nixon is sitting in the pew. He didn't want to be there, but he felt that he had to be as a candidate for president in 1968. So all these characters come back. Martin Luther King's life draws them all back in again. And we felt that that was the appropriate place to end the book, because it brought the story to a very powerful and poignant kind of culmination.
So can we segue for a minute from Daddy King to Daddy Kendrick? And I'm wondering, I co-wrote one book with a woman named Kitty Dukakis, and at the end of it, we became lifelong friends, and I vowed never to co-write a book with anybody again. The idea of having my co-writer be either my father or my son is something difficult to imagine. Paul, talk about what it was like working with your dad, and Stephen, you get the last word on that. So.
Well, we have no egos, so we really, not that you or Kitty did, but we have I think you really in the artistry of the creation, knowing that it is hard when something I wrote that I thought was great, he just cuts out, or vice versa. But we do have different strengths that complement each other so well, and that I did a lot of the primary source research and just like, I mean, he says his eyes can't do it, but I get into the microfilm, and I love reading 1960 newspapers. I want to know everything going on in Atlanta on October 19th, 1960. I want you to be there. I loved spending time with these Atlanta student movement veterans. And the story all started because a neighbor in Boston said, hey, you should talk to my mentor, Harris Wofford. He's almost 90, but he's passionate. You're passionate about civil rights. You should be him. And it began with a conversation with Harris that's fascinating. He was a white advisor to Martin Luther King, who went to Howard Law School again as a white dude in the 1940s, and then goes on to help Shriver start Peace Corps and run AmeriCorps, be a senator from Pennsylvania, marry a man right before his death who he had fallen in love with. I mean, just a fascinating American life. And so Harris's kindness and the time I spent with him in DC, well, Harris had worked in the Kennedy White House, and a few days I took my lunch break from the Obama White House to go talk to Harris, and he had one floor on the same floor I was working in. It's really cool. But my father is such an incredible writer and just has such a gift for lively prose that just really jumps out. And so I think he immeasurably was always making it, I think, a great experience for a reader. And so we just have a nice kind of back and forth. And our editors really forced us to make this as concise as possible and made us cut so much, which we really thank them for, because the story, I think, really flows and really reads. But that took a lot of being able to sacrifice something you found that you thought was so great. And but we have a lot of fun with it. I treasure it. I'm so lucky to get to do it with the parent and certainly Sarah's Long Walk. We love the Massachusetts Historical Society so much, and Sarah's Long Walk was our contribution to hopefully Boston knowing its own history, and a hopeful piece of history of the first school desegregation case and community win of that struggle for to desegregate Massachusetts schools in 1855. And Mass Historical Society has always done an amazing job of telling those stories, and so we thank them for letting us tell this story today. But anyway, all that to say, we have a lot of fun together doing it. A lot of people wouldn't let their parents correct their papers, but I'm willing to write a trilogy about hopeful moments of interracial collaboration in American history and history that can inspire and we can learn from, not sentimentally, but with kind of clear eyes with my father. So we've had so it's just a really, really fortunate thing that we've had a lot of fun doing.
And each book has been very different in terms of how we each contribute. Our second book on Douglas and Lincoln, Paul actually, is listed as the top writer because he wrote, more than 60% of the book. So each book has found its own way, and as we each grow and mature, we've developed in different skill sets, and I do think that we enjoy it, and I must say, I get a very powerful push from Paul, his strong idealism, his belief that it is in confronting race that we begin to try to solve the conundrum of what being an American is all about. His passion for that has really helped and informed me, and I hope that I brought a lot of creative writing skills, which I majored in college, to basically bring that to the table. So yeah, I think we work together well.
And the short answer is Google Docs. We did it over Google Docs, so we could be editing simultaneously. It would be insane to try to just pass the Microsoft Word documents back and forth. So I got that on Google Docs, and that way we should be editing simultaneously. And the book was his idea because he has such a great instinct for stories of saying, that's an unbelievable story that someone you're talking to, impacted the 1960 election and this transformational moment in Martin Luther King's life. Let's start reading that down on paper, just like he had been when we learned in our neighborhood in Boston that the 100-year road to Brown versus the Board of Education began on the backside of Beacon Hill. And so I'm very lucky that, we have his instinct for stories that should be told, and, that hadn't always been, centered in history.
So you guys are great on stories that ought to be told. We've got piling up questions that ought to be asked from the audience. And the first
lightning
one is,
round.
Seriously, great. Can you talk more about Daddy King's influence on Martin's life and early activism? Whoever wants to take that.
I think that King defined himself off of his father. He understood that his father had just a powerful, instinctive ability to move people. I mean, he was a great minister, and I think King decided that he was going to be deeply sophisticated and intellectual, but he ended up circling back to his father. He ended up understanding his father's power, and I think that he returned to Atlanta to be co-pastor with his father, because I think his father provided some emotional protection for him, and he bristled sometimes under that, as who wouldn't? But Daddy King always understood the danger that his son was in, and there was no one short of Coretta who was more instinctively looking out for King, understanding where the dangers were. So in writing this book, we really had some insight into their relationship, and how Martin Luther King did define himself off of his father in very powerful ways. But in
And
the
that
end,
Daddy King and did not want a key piece of where this plays out in the book is that though that Daddy King did not want King to do this sit-in with the students. He had promised older Black leaders, my son's moving home, but he's going to worry about those backwoods places in Georgia. He's not, we have some good accommodations and arrangements here in Atlanta, but the young people had the urgency for equality, and really you can read about it in chapter 2. They put pressure on King. You got to put your body on the line like we have. We were inspired by what you did in Montgomery, but you've never gone to jail overnight. And Daddy King really doesn't want him to do it. And he was understandably protective and worried for his son. And so it's a very confrontational scene between Lonnie, the student leader who helped us tell this scene, and Daddy King, with Martin Jr. kind of going back and forth, but ultimately making the decision that he needed to lay his life on the line and do the sit-in with the students. And so Daddy King was greatly worried, and then his instincts were right that King was heading into a danger that the students didn't even understand.
Right.
But thankfully, King survives this moment. So yeah, fascinating relationship.
So in lightning round question number 2, you discovered some amazing sources for this book. With all the books written about King and JFK, any ideas why those sources hadn't been uncovered before?
Well, I was going to say,
I think that we. Sorry.
No. Well, I was going to say the transcript that Paul found, the biographer of Donald Hollowell did not have access to. So I think one of the lessons we learned, and you can talk about this too, Larry, is I don't care how many books have been written, there's always stuff to be found. Because if you just dig, there is stuff there that other people have ignored or just haven't seen, or other librarians and researchers are just bringing into light. And that's what we discovered.
Yeah, and I think it's just about the focus of the book, that, this was part of a chapter in your book that you were telling the story of Bobby Kennedy's life, right? And there have been books about the 1960 campaign or about Martin Luther King's life. And so they're telling a multi-year story. And we just wanted to tell a different story that required more detail about this incident that had been part of chapters or a chapter, but we wanted to fully bring it out and do that with characters who, obviously Kennedy and Nixon and King are a huge part of this book, but we wanted to really bring forth some of these behind the scenes characters like the Lonnie King and the Atlanta student movement, the women and men of that movement, doing these sit-ins of the advisors, principally Louis Martin, but with Whopper Schreiber. And so, I think that then you go down the rabbit hole of looking for things, and then you're going to find things. And so, it is great that in every and so we got to read great books like yours and find things, and you helped us with the interview of someone we didn't get to talk to in Bobby's advisor, Siegenthaler. But the other thing, though, I think, the fact that you got to talk to John Siegenthaler before he passed is kind of similar to we more than 5 people that we got crucial interviews from, sadly, have passed since we wrote it. You know, Vernon Jordan was the most recent one. He was there during these days in Atlanta, and it's and so that's hard because you care about people you meet so much, but you also feel, you know, grateful that you did this, and that these are part of the historical record, and you paid, you know, tribute to great heroes like again, like these women and men in the Atlanta student movement.
So right before our book was published, Harris Wofford died on Martin Luther King Day, 2019, which is, you can't make this stuff up, you know.
It's incredible. So a really good question here. You've spoken several times. This listener says about a 7% shift in the black vote. What was that 7% of, and what states specifically shifted to Kennedy because of the shift we're talking about?
So it was Kennedy did 7% of the black vote nationally moved Democratic from the previous election from 1956. People thought Nixon was going to do better with the black vote than Eisenhower had, and Eisenhower had won in a landslide. But you know, he was getting over 40% of the black vote. People thought Nixon could hit 50. Instead, it goes the other way. Kennedy adds 7 percentage points to his margins. So the states that we think that made, you know, a crucial difference, and in a close election, everything makes a difference. So I do want to be clear on that. But that clearly there's more black votes than the difference were Delaware, Illinois, Maryland, Michigan, Missouri, New Jersey, North Carolina, Pennsylvania, Texas, and South Carolina. I had to pull up the footnote. I don't have those memorized, but so anyway, those are states that definitely, and it's probably more states than that, but that was like pretty clear, and it is a fascinating to watch the. But then 4 years after this election, and as LBJ embraces civil rights, you know, legislation after the martyr Kennedy is dead, then he wins over 90% of the black vote, and that's where it's remained ever since. So we think this was a critical turning point where it could have been 50-50 in America. It was getting close to that. Instead, Louis Martin, and Robert Shriver, and the Kennedy brothers really make this crucial 7% shift.
Was there any corollary shift in white vote, in white segregationist vote? They won 7% more of the black vote than Eisenhower had.
Yeah.
Did Kennedy lose any of the white vote that he would have been expected to have in Georgia or anywhere else, or was all this happening under the radar?
Yeah, the Republican Party, well, an interesting place is in DeKalb County, which was the county where King was arrested, and where he was persecuted from his arrest in Atlanta because he'd had the driving ticket violation in DeKalb. Republicans did better than they ever had before. We got a little newspaper article about it, and so, you know, that is just, and Coretta thought of DeKalb as Klan County, Klan country. Of course, now it's a diverse suburb of Atlanta that just elected the minister of King's church, Warnock, to the Senate with a Jewish man, Ossoff. But then it was, you know, but that was the harbinger of this shift. It's a good question. I'd have to go look at the numbers. I mean, they were really worried about losing Texas, for instance, and like probably without Johnson, the Kennedy wouldn't have held that on. And so, you know, Kennedy was playing, the Kennedy brothers were playing an amazing balancing act. You know, Johnson's helping them hold on to Texas. You know, I think they ended up winning Georgia pretty comfortably, but everything was pretty close. But that they're shifting these black votes in places like Illinois and, you know, New York and you know, and these other states.
So we're certainly not
last words.
We're certainly not the first to, you know, make many of these points, and political scientists have, you know, they're quoted in our footnotes. One of the nice things our editors did is they cut our book by nearly 200 pages, but we were able to.
They said we had to do it, and we cut it by 200 pages. Yeah.
So we think we have a much better book, but that information is right there in the footnotes, and we feel very comfortable with what the work that other political scientists have done on that.
And to answer Mark's question, there was one poll of some Black votes in 6 states that happened to happen before and after this letter, and you see in some of them the big jump in support for Kennedy. But you ask about Illinois, and Kennedy went from 76% to 82% of Black support in Illinois, which was not as big as a jump as a place but like some of the other states which were higher jumps. I don't want to bore everyone else with it, but yeah, there was actually evidence of that movement that was happening in Illinois, and that was crucial in those South Side Chicago wards in a really, really close state.
So before I turn it back to Gavin, I want to just say 2 last words. One is that if you were all in person at one of the great events that Gavin and Sarah run generally when there's not a pandemic, I would be encouraging you all. I would say there's a quid pro quo in these talks. Smart authors come and give up an evening to talk to you, and you go buy their book. You can still do that, and you ought to go buy their book, and they are going to, or Gavin will explain that they will do what they do at those book signings, which is send you in the mail a signature plate. The other thing that I urge you to do, and that I would urge you to do if we were in person, is to, when you're pulling out your wallets to buy their book, pull out your wallets to sign up for a membership at Mass Historical, because they run programs like this and they give up 60 evenings a year to do these kinds of things. And Gavin, it's yours.
Thank you very much, Larry. I think you have covered most of the bases, and thank you, Stephen and Paul. And Paul, of course, we hope you have good news very, very soon. And it's amazing we made it through. So I think that you can tell your wife, all right, we're ready to go.
I'll tell her right down to the belly. Okay, baby, I'm ready.
But I just want to thank all 3 of you for really a wonderful discussion and a great program. We will follow up with all of the people who've attended with an email. And if they would like a signed plate, if they can just respond to our email, and we'll take care of it from there. We do encourage people to buy a copy of the book. We are a huge fan of supporting local bookstores. We're not necessarily promoting any single one, but there are certainly plenty in the Boston area, the Harvard Bookstore, the Porter Square Books, Trident Bookstore, to name a few. And if you're not in Metro Boston, bookshop.org is a nonprofit which does support a whole bunch of local retailers. So we hope you'll buy a copy of the book, and we hope that you'll support a local bookstore doing so. And I want to wish everyone a great Tuesday evening, and we'll see everyone soon.
Thank you so much, Larry, for doing this event. This is so kind of you. And thank you, Gavin and Sarah, for all your work in putting it together. Mass Historical Society is such a valuable gem of an institution. So thank you to the whole community for spending this time with us. Thanks again, Larry.
Thank you.